The birth of Japan, the Yamato era. A not-so-old civilization. When we think of the Far East, we often imagine that the societies here, at least before globalization took hold in the 20th century, lived according to traditions which go back to the beginning of recorded history. This is true to some extent of the mainland. The first stirrings of ancient Chinese society began to emerge as far back as 3000 BCE. Their writing system, advanced agriculture, literature, and culture all began to emerge slowly thereafter, and things like Confucianism and some of the ancient texts which have remained central to Chinese tradition and society appeared in the first millennium BCE. We might casually assume that the same processes were underway slightly further east on the islands of the Japanese archipelago, but this was not so. Japan was actually largely stuck within the prehistoric era until about 1000 BCE, and its inhabitants were still largely hunter-gatherers. It was only from around 1000 BCE onwards when the Yayoi people migrated from the Asian mainland to the home islands, bringing with them some of the advances that had been made already in China, that Japanese society began to evolve. Even then, the process was slow, and the features of traditional Japanese society, with its distinctive architecture, honor system, and samurais, did not emerge for quite some time. In fact, these features of Japanese life largely only came into being during the middle centuries of the first millennium CE, by which time the Roman Empire had already largely come and gone from the Mediterranean. This era, in which Japanese traditional culture emerged, is called the Yamato era, and ran roughly from the 3rd to the early 8th centuries CE. Japan in the 3rd century CE. Any assessment of how Japan changed during the Yamato period should probably start by looking at where matters stood at the beginning of the era. At the dawn of the 3rd century CE, Japan was a deeply divided country. The country was largely pre-literate at this stage, and so much of our evidence for the early 1st millennium CE comes either from archaeological evidence or written texts produced in China and Korea. This by itself is somewhat striking. China had gone through thousands of years of fairly vibrant cultural development already by this time, particularly so during the 1st millennium BCE, a period of time in which the country produced the famous terracotta army, or terracotta warriors, Confucianism, Sun Tzu's The Art of War, and a host of foundational Chinese texts such as the I Ching, the Bamboo Annals, and the records of the Grand Historian. Japan had none of that, a sign of how comparatively underdeveloped the island archipelago was. Moreover, it was a very divided place. The Book of Han, written in China around 110 CE, refers to Japan as the Land of Wa, and stated that it was divided into 100 different kingdoms. The economy and society of the islands were also comparatively backwards. Agriculture had been widely adopted, and there was an advanced textiles industry, but these were of a subsistence kind, something which in part explains why larger centralized powers had not yet emerged. In terms of metalworking, the people of the Japanese islands were also noticeably still reliant on bronze during this period, where ironworking had become common in other more developed parts of the world many centuries earlier. There was technological and social change beginning to creep in from the mainland of the Far East, often being elements of Chinese culture that were arriving via the Korean peninsula. One such development was the introduction of a writing system, the introduction of Kanji. One of the most important facets of the development of Japanese society during the Yamato era was the introduction of Kanji. This is the logographic system of Chinese characters which comprises the ancient writing system of Japan and which continues to be used in many ways in Japan down to the present day. The term kanji transliterates as Han characters, this being a reference to the writing system that was associated with the Han dynasty that ruled China for a period of 400 years between 202 BCE and 220 CE. The Chinese writing system came from China via the Korean peninsula in the 5th century CE. It was not exactly the same as the Chinese forebear. Instead, kanji had picked up influences in Korea and was adapted to fit local needs once it arrived to the Japanese archipelago. The writing system, though, remains essentially Chinese to this day, though while using a Japanese system of pronunciation. The first documents ever produced using kanji probably consisted of diplomatic missives between the rulers of Japan and those of China or Korea. But it soon diffused down the social hierarchy of Japan as the benefits of a complex writing system were recognized. Kanji was hugely significant in terms of the development of writing and literature in Japan. It also spawned numerous more indigenous Japanese calligraphic writing systems such as hiragana, the system that some of the great works of Japanese literature, such as the Tale of Genji, were written in. Unification. Perhaps the most important development in Yamato history was the manner in which the Japanese lordships were united for the first time under a strong kingship. As we have seen, in the 2nd century CE, Chinese writers described the Japanese islands as being divided into 100 different polities. Between the 3rd and 6th centuries, a central kingship emerged, one which eventually morphed into an imperial rule with the first emperors reigning over Japan from Yamato. This was based on a tribal alliance centered on the Yamato region in what is now the Nara Prefecture in the central region of the island of Honshu, the largest island of the archipelago. Nara Prefecture lies near Tokyo, Kyoto, and Osaka, and has always been at the epicenter of Japanese political history. Although the Yamato kingship is poorly documented, it is clear that the manner in which it began to unite neighboring lordships under its rule was unprecedented in Japanese history up to that point. Ultimately, the Yamato rulers would exercise some form of control over the western and central regions of Honshu, as well as the islands of Shikoku and the northern half of Kyushu. The eastern end of Honshu and the more northerly home island, Hokkaido, remained beyond the control of the Yamato kings. Furthermore, the exact nature of Yamato kingship has been extensively debated. Did the Yamato kings rule fully over this territory, or were they a kind of overlord of different vassals that pledged fealty to the Yamato rulers in a feudal manner? Nobody is really sure about this. Still, while many questions remain unanswered about the Yamato kingship, there is no doubt that in unifying approximately half of the territory of modern-day Japan under some kind of central leadership, there was a new departure in the country's politics during the Yamato era. The Kofun and Asuka periods. The period of the ascendancy of the Yamato kings would last for over 400 years, down to the 7th century CE. This era is often broken down into two distinct periods, the Kofun and Asuka periods. The Kofun period began around 250 CE and lasted down to the year 538 CE. Its name derives from the large burial mounds that were constructed by the Yamato kings and other rulers during it. These Kofun burial mounds were large mound tombs built in a shape which resembles a keyhole if viewed aerially from above. On the ground, the circular part of the keyhole shape was the main tomb. Then the lower end of the keyhole was the platform and entry area into it. These parts of the tomb were at the top of an artificially built mound, often with layers leading up to it. Sometimes the mounds were surrounded by moats. Elite Kofun were often upwards of 400 meters in length, and might take thousands of workers laboring for several years to build them. However, non-elite Kofun as little as 1 meter long in size and similar to a modern-day grave have been found all over Japan. Over 160,000 Kofun have been identified in total. As was typical of elite burial tombs, from the pyramids of Egypt to the kurgans of Russia, the tomb itself would be filled with valuable funerary goods such as weapons, gold objects, and figurines, called hanawa in the Japanese tradition. These were made from terracotta clay and would be shaped into animal and human figures. It is impossible to escape comparisons with the terracotta army of Emperor Qin Shi Huang of China from 500 years earlier, and evidently Chinese elite burial practices were diffusing to Japan. The funerary objects also point towards an increased prevalence of ironworking in Japan during this period and wide technological development. The Kofun period gave way in 538 to the Asuka period. The main distinction between the two eras, as we will see in more detail later, was that 538 is seen as marking the beginning of the introduction of Buddhism into Japan, where previously the people of the archipelago had almost exclusively been Shinto worshippers. Generally speaking, the Yamato state became more centralized during this latter period. Diplomatic contacts with China and Korea improved. There was also a transition away from Japan being referred to as Y in Chinese and Korean sources to become known as Nippon. And this reflects more Japanese terminology for their islands at this time. In 710 CE, the capital moved to Haijokyo, modern-day Nara, a move which symbolized the end of the Yamato period and the beginning of the Nara era. By then, Japan was a very different place to what it had been back in 250 CE at the start of the Yamato era. The arrival of Buddhism. Let's look at some of the main developments involved now in a bit more detail. As noted, the primary point of distinction between the Kofun period, or early Yamato era, and the Asuka period, or later Yamato era, was the arrival of Buddhism to Japan. Prior to the Yamato era, the universal religion of the people of the Japanese archipelago was what we now call the Shinto religion. This is a polytheistic and animist religion, one in which a pantheon of multiple deities are worshipped, with all beings said to be possessed of a spirit that animates them. That began to change in the 6th century CE. Japanese historical lore holds that Buddhism was introduced to Japan from Korea in the year 538, when the ruler of the kingdom of Baekje on the Korean peninsula sent a diplomatic mission to the Yamato court. The emissaries were said to have brought gifts with them that included a statue of the Buddha and books with some key Buddhist writings. People at the Yamato court were intrigued, and many began to investigate this religion from the mainland further. Buddhism gradually gained adherents thereafter. While the story itself might be spurious, and many historians of early Japanese society suggest the first references to Buddhism date to the early 550s CE, what is beyond dispute is that Buddhism first arrived to Japan and gained traction there in the middle of the 6th century CE. The new religion did not gain universal acceptance. Indeed, the arrival of this foreign faith, with its emphasis on a preeminent godlike figure and very different philosophical and moral system, aroused considerable hostility in some sectors of society. The Soga clan championed the new religion at the Yamato court, but other clans, such as the Nakatomi and Mononobe, were much more opposed to it and believed that any consideration of this new system would generate the hostility of the gods of the traditional Shinto system. Despite their reservations, Buddhism spread outwards from the court, and towards the end of the 6th century, we begin to see Buddhist temples being built in greater numbers, notably the Asuka temple in the Nara prefecture, not far from the Yamato court. This still stands today and is believed to be one of the oldest Buddhist temples in Japan, with a large bronze-cast statue of the Buddha dating to the early 7th century. A key figure in promoting Buddhism in Yamato, Japan was Prince Shotoku, a son of Emperor Yomei, a Yamato ruler of the mid-580 CE. Shotoku was a devout Buddhist. In 593, he became regent of Japan during the reign of his cousin, Empress Suiko. Using his position, he would preside over a campaign to foster Buddhism around the Yamato dominions. He is, for instance, credited with organizing the construction of several Buddhist temples, including that of Horyuji, while he also sent missions to China and Korea to study Buddhism more closely there. The prince is also said to have been the driving force behind the 17-article constitution of 604 CE, which promoted the inclusion of Buddhist and Confucian principles into Japan's system of government and social organization. The end result of all of this was not a situation in which Buddhism replaced Shintoism as the dominant religion of Japan. Instead, many people adopted Buddhism or elements of Confucianism alongside their Shinto belief. This syncretic amalgamation of Shinto and Buddhist principles is known as Shinbutsu Shugo. It manifested as Buddhist temples being built alongside Shinto shrines and dual forms of worship. To this day, around 70% of the population of Japan identify as Buddhists, while over 65% claim to still be adherents of Shintoism, indicating significant overlap between the two belief systems a millennium and a half after Buddhism was first introduced. This dual religious landscape is a product of the Yamato era. An architectural revolution. The introduction of Buddhism to Japan during the latter part of the Yamato era was significant in more ways than one. Visitors to Japan today, and anyone familiar with its historic buildings at places like Kyoto, will be familiar with the unique architecture of the archipelago. This is largely a product of the Yamato era and the architectural revolution that came about as Buddhism spread across the islands. Prior to the arrival of Buddhism, Japanese architecture was greatly influenced by Shintoism. Shinto shrines, which were known as jinja, were relatively simple structures fashioned out of wood with thatch roofs. The substances used were ephemeral, meaning they decayed over time due to weather erosion, and examples have not survived down to the present day. Indeed, the transient nature of Shinto shrines was purposeful, adherents believing that the rebuilding of their shrines every 20 years or so symbolized renewal and rebirth. By way of contrast, Buddhism brought with it a distinct architectural approach from the Chinese mainland. Buddhist temples were built on a much grander scale than were their Shinto forebears, and so the arrival of the new religion brought with it a more ambitious form of architecture. Some of this was simply practical. Buddhism often involves the housing of very large Buddha statues within temple precincts. Bigger buildings were needed to do so. It was also through this new form of religious architecture that the concept of pagodas, the use of tiered tower buildings, began to enter Japanese building methods. These were ultimately derived from Indian stupas, the building method having moved eastwards from the home of Buddhism to the Far East, and then Japan. Though a Japanese pagoda is a very different thing to an Indian stupa. The earliest such pagoda building still standing in Japan is the Horyuji Pagoda, built by Prince Shotoku in 607 CE, though it was subsequently damaged by lightning in 670 and rebuilt. There was also a greater symmetry introduced into such buildings and the complexes they were built within it. A central axis was planned out, where the main sanctum, pagoda, and gates of the complex were in line with one another. The woodwork on the buildings was also of a higher quality, with Buddhists placing emphasis on the use of finer materials to produce these edifices. The Horyuji Pagoda is a classic example of this. Despite being built over 1,300 years ago, in large part out of wooden beams, the structure is largely intact, as it was either built in 607 CE or rebuilt after 670 CE, making this one of the oldest wooden structures found anywhere in the world today. This new style incorporated numerous elements of pre-Buddhist, Shinto-style architecture. For instance, the use of raised floors on stilts or platforms predated the arrival of Buddhism in Japanese architecture. This largely evolved out of the functional use of such elevated floors to protect the goods stored in granaries and storehouses from moisture and pests. Later, these elements of functional architecture were applied to elite architecture. While late Yamato architecture tended to dispense with thatched roofs in favor of more elegant and durable wood and slate roofs, the concept of using curved gabled roofs was retained. One need only look at Japanese temples and fortresses built over the centuries like Himeji Castle to see that many centuries later gabled ends were still being used extensively in elite Japanese architecture. Finally, late Yamato building methods continued to integrate buildings into the natural environment in which they were located. One will notice that ancient Japanese buildings that still stand today have a much more natural feel, almost as though the builders were trying not to disrupt the landscape in which these structures sat. This style first developed in the Yamato era and has had a long and enduring influence over Japanese society. The Code of Taiho. Another pillar of Japanese traditional society, which emerged towards the end of the Yamato era, was the enshrining of the Code of Taiho, or Taiho Code. This was the most important of a series of law codes and administrative systems imposed by the government between 640 and 740, which saw the way in which Japan was governed codified and a rigid social hierarchy developed. A precursor to it was the Taika reform promulgated by Emperor Kotoku in the year 645. The goal of the reforms was to create a more powerful central government by reorganizing how the country was administered. The emperor began appointing more officials to govern the provinces on his behalf and collect larger tributes. These officials were known as the kokushi and would continue to play a role in the governance of Japan down to the 19th century. At the same time, Japanese scholars and scribes were sent to China and Korea to learn more about the administrative system there. These earlier efforts were added to the enshrinement of the Code of Taiho in the year 703 by Emperor Monmu. Through this, Japan was divided up into provinces and administrative units in a system that again would largely prevail until the Meiji-era reforms of the 19th century. A layer of administration below the provinces was added equivalent to districts called a gun and headed by a gunji. There were 66 provinces as a result and 592 districts. Though the number has changed considerably over time, the administrative divisions enshrined through the Taika and Taiho codes have remained central to Japanese administration and local government down to modern times. Such has been the enduring nature of the Yamato-era social and political reforms. On top of this, it involved a codification of a large number of laws which should be imposed by the gunji and other local officials, surrounding everything from the management of religious life in local communities to how the courts were to carry out their business. There were also agricultural reforms incorporated, ones designed to improve the output of Japanese farmers. These reforms were further added to by additional codes like the Yoro Code, which followed towards the end of the Yamato era. All of these Yamato-era codes would remain legally in force in Japan until the modernization policies were introduced after the Meiji Restoration of 1868. The birth of the samurai system. The promulgation and implementation of the Code of Taiho was important in the development of the samurai system in Japan as well. The samurai system is basically a caste system. Today, it is more commonly associated with a certain type of military warrior and ethos in the popular imagination. But in reality, it divided Japanese society into a hierarchy of individuals, some of whom served the feudal lords directly and others who were much further down the social ladder. For instance, some samurai were hereditary bureaucrats responsible for things like overseeing the collection of rice and other basic commodities in the regions and ensuring that the feudal lords and the imperial government received their share of each district's produce. This samurai system would only evolve gradually and come to full realization between the 11th and 13th centuries. But the seeds of it were laid down during the later Yamato or Asuka period. The Code of Taiho provided for the establishment of 12 different ranks of imperial and local bureaucrats, which were in turn divided into sub-ranks. This established who was subservient to whom and what the responsibilities of each class or rank were to one another, all framed within the honor system which would become so intrinsic to Japanese society over time. Crucially, within this ranking system in the Code of Taiho, the term saburao, a verb meaning to serve, was included. The term samurai comes from this verb saburao, though it would not be applied to the military ranks of the caste system for centuries to come. Looking forwards. The Yamato era is typically identified as ending around 710 CE, as the capital was moved from Yamato to Heijokyo in what is now Nara. As a result, the subsequent period is known as the Nara era, one which lasted through most of the 8th century before rulers began moving to the region around Kyoto, which would become the heartland of Japanese imperial rule down to the modern age. While the Yamato ended with the move to Nara in the early 8th century, the Yamato era, which lasted over 4.5 centuries from 250 CE onwards, was absolutely vital in the country's history. Before it, Japan had been a deeply divided country of over 100 lordships, one in which elite architecture was rare. Society was still dominated by subsistence agriculture without any unifying social hierarchy, and in which Shintoism dominated as the religious and philosophical system. By the time the capital was moved to Nara in the early 8th century, that had all changed. A strong central power had emerged in the shape of the emperors ruling from central Honshu over much of the archipelago. A social and bureaucratic system had been developed centered on administrative units and the samurai system, while Buddhism had transformed both the religious landscape and the nature of Japanese architecture. All of these changes would continue to shape and dominate Japanese society until the modernization program of the Meiji Restoration commenced in the late 19th century. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel to show your support and watch more content like this. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. That's it for now. We'll see you in the next one.